The Horus Heresy had already claimed millions of lives. 3 loyal legions had been shattered on the black sands of Isstvan V. Brother had turned against brother. The Imperium was bleeding. But Horus knew the war had only just begun, because one legion still stood between him and victory. The Ultramarines. More than 100,000 Space Marines, the largest legion in the Imperium. Masters of logistics, masters of discipline, masters of war. Led by Roboute Guilliman. If the Ultramarines reached Terra in force, Horus's rebellion could still be crushed. They had to be stopped. Not defeated, destroyed. That task fell to another Primarch, Lorgar Aurelian. Years earlier, the Emperor had humiliated him before his entire legion. He had burned Monarchia, broken the Word-bearers, destroyed the faith that had defined Lorgar's life. But instead of destroying him, the Emperor had driven him into the arms of chaos. Now the first heretic had returned, and this time he wasn't looking for forgiveness. He was looking for revenge. His target wasn't Terra, it was Ultramar, the realm Roboute Guilliman had spent decades building. A kingdom of 500 prosperous worlds, the greatest achievement of any Primarch. If Ultramar could be crippled, the Imperium would lose far more than another legion. It would lose its strongest foundation. But Guilliman could never suspect the truth. Not yet. Officially, the Word-bearers had come as allies. Both legions had been ordered to gather in the Calth system. Together, they would prepare for a massive campaign against the Orc Empire of Guslak. It looked like another Great Crusade deployment. Thousands of warships, millions of soldiers, countless armored columns and supply convoys. Everything appeared routine. Everything appeared peaceful. That illusion was exactly what Lorgar wanted. Because this was never a military operation. It was an execution. Every ship entering the system, every convoy unloading supplies, every ammunition stockpile, every fuel depot, every defensive position, the Word-bearers studied them all, not as allies, as targets. Kor Phaeron oversaw the hidden preparations. Erebus ensured every detail unfolded exactly as planned. Nothing was left to chance. The attack had been calculated months in advance. Every minute, every casualty, every betrayal. Meanwhile, the Ultramarines welcomed their cousins without suspicion. That was simply Guilliman's way. The 13th Legion valued order above everything. Trust was part of that order. The Word-bearers had fought beside them for decades. Many officers knew each other personally. Some had bled together on distant worlds. Others had become close friends during the Great Crusade. They shared victories, stories, respect. None of them imagined those same brothers were about to put a bolt round through their hearts. Across Calth's orbit, enormous dockyards filled with warships. Orbital stations bustled with activity. Servitors carried ammunition. Mechanicum crews repaired cruisers. Legionaries moved between vessels as if preparing for another glorious campaign. Nobody realized they were standing inside the perfect kill zone. The first blow would not be struck on the battlefield. It would come long before either legion officially declared war. And when it did, the Horus Heresy would enter one of its darkest chapters. The first victim of Calth died long before the battle began, long before the alarms, long before the explosions, long before anyone realized the Horus Heresy had reached Ultramar. 136 hours before the attack, an Imperial supply ship called Campanile disappeared. No distress signal, no warning, no survivors. More than 3,000 crew members were executed aboard the vessel. Not because they had resisted, not because they were important, because they were no longer needed. The ship itself had become the weapon. Its navigation systems were rewritten, its engines locked at maximum thrust, its transponder continued broadcasting perfectly normal approach codes. To every scanner in the Calth system, Campanile looked exactly like another routine supply vessel returning home. In reality, it was a guided missile. Meanwhile, aboard the Macragg's Honor, Roboute Guilliman prepared to welcome his brother's legion. Everything appeared to be proceeding according to schedule. The fleet was assembling. Supply lines were operational. Dockyards overflowed with activity, exactly as Guilliman had planned. Yet beneath that perfect order, something invisible had already begun spreading. Scrap code. Corrupted machine logic. It slipped through communication relays, data engines, mechanicum systems. Silent, patient, almost impossible to detect. The poison spread a little further every hour. Elsewhere aboard the fleet, another Ultramarine waited for judgment. Sergeant Aenid Thiel. He wasn't preparing for war. He was preparing to answer for his own ideas. His crime sounded almost absurd. He had written a series of technical studies exploring one impossible question. How do you defeat another Space Marine? Most officers considered the idea offensive, disloyal, even dangerous. Space Marines were created to fight the enemies of mankind, not each other. Why waste time imagining something that could never happen? Thiel disagreed. His duty, he believed, was to prepare for every battlefield, even the impossible ones. For that belief, he had been marked for censure, his helmet painted red, his reputation ruined. Within hours, those same theories would become the difference between life and death. Elsewhere in orbit, aboard the cruiser Samothrace, another reunion was taking place. Captain Honorius Luciel stepped forward to greet an old friend, Sora Tachura, a captain of the Word-Bearers. The two warriors had fought side by side during the Great Crusade, shared campaigns, shared victories, shared respect. Luciel welcomed him without hesitation. The airlock doors opened. The two Space Marines approached one another. Then Luciel noticed something. The armor. Word-Bearer's armor had always been gray. Now it was crimson, dark bronze, a color Luciel had never seen before. For the briefest moment, instinct whispered that something was wrong. Then he ignored it. Tachura smiled, raised his plasma pistol, and fired. The blast punched through Luciel's chest. Ceramite vanished.
bone vanished. Both of the Ultramarines' hearts were vaporized in an instant. Luciel never even had time to draw his weapon. The first loyal Space Marine had fallen. At that exact moment, the signal was given. Across the Calth system, hidden word-bearers agents activated simultaneously. Weapons were drawn. Communications failed. Sabotage teams struck. And Campanile accelerated toward the largest orbital dockyard in the system. There was no warning, no chance to react, only the certainty that within seconds, Calth would burn.
The collision could be seen from orbit. Then the light swallowed everything. Campanile slammed into Calth's primary orbital dockyard at nearly 40% of the speed of light. There was no explosion at first, only impact. Then came the fire. Entire docking platforms disappeared in an instant. Cruisers waiting for deployment were torn apart before their crews even understood what had happened. Steel vaporized. Void shields collapsed. Fragments of burning warships were hurled across orbit like shrapnel. Thousands died within seconds. Then, tens of thousands. The blast wave raced through the surrounding fleet. Ships smashed into one another. Fuel reserves ignited. Docking arms twisted apart like paper. The perfect order Guilliman had spent months creating vanished in less than a minute. Across the system, the scrap codes struck all at once. Communication arrays went silent. Targeting systems malfunctioned. Machine spirits screamed beneath corrupted commands. On Calth's orbital defense network, operators desperately tried to understand what was happening. Their consoles flooded with impossible data. Warning signals overlapped until they became meaningless. The noosphere collapsed into chaos. Many of the Mechanicum adepts never had the chance to react. The corrupted code reached them through their neural links. Some collapsed instantly. Others convulsed as their minds burned from within. The planetary defense grid went dark. Void shields failed. Weapons batteries stopped responding. Calth had become blind and completely defenseless. Meanwhile, debris from orbit began falling toward the planet. At first, it looked like a meteor shower. Then people realized the stars were getting bigger. Entire warships were crashing through the atmosphere. Their hulls burned brighter than the sun. Across Calth, cities stopped and watched the sky. Nobody understood what they were seeing. Not yet. Then the first impact came. A 12-kilometer cruiser struck the surface with enough force to erase an entire district. The explosion flattened everything for miles. Shock waves rolled across the landscape. Mountains cracked. Cities disappeared beneath walls of fire and dust. More wreckage followed. One ship, then another, then dozens more. The heavens themselves seemed to be falling. Captain Remus Ventanus watched the destruction unfold from the surface. For a moment, even he struggled to understand it. This wasn't an invasion. It wasn't a bombardment. It was annihilation. The surviving Ultramarines immediately abandoned any hope of restoring order. Their mission had changed.
Save whoever could still be saved. Then Tanis gathered every warrior he could find. Legionaries, Imperial Army soldiers, civilians, anyone still alive. The only chance of survival lay beneath the surface. Calth's vast underground archaeology network had been built to survive almost anything. Almost. As refugees flooded toward the shelters, the sky continued to rain burning steel. The greatest military assembly in Ultramar's history had become its greatest disaster. And beneath the flames, something even worse was beginning to awaken.
While Calth burned, one man had no idea the galaxy was asking him to save it. His name was Persson. To everyone around him, he was nothing more than an old farmer, a quiet man living far from the great cities, far from politics, far from war. That was exactly how he wanted it. He had seen enough battlefields to last several lifetimes, because, in truth, he had. Long before there was an Imperium, long before there were Primarchs, long before Terra had reached the stars, Persson had already been fighting. He had survived civilizations that history no longer remembered, empires that had turned to dust, wars that had vanished from memory. He had walked through humanity's darkest ages, and somehow he had never died. When the first wreckage fell from orbit, watched the horizon disappear beneath smoke and fire. The ground shook beneath his feet. A wall of water raced across the plains. He barely had time to gather the people working beside him before the tidal wave swallowed everything they owned. His home vanished. His fields vanished. Years of quiet life disappeared in a single afternoon. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, a familiar voice returned. John Grammaticus. Not in person, inside his mind. John warned him that Calth was only the beginning. The Horus Heresy would consume the entire Imperium. And if nothing changed, humanity itself might not survive. There was something hidden beneath Calth, something ancient, a path that could eventually lead to Terra. Didn't want any part of it. He had spent centuries trying to stay away from history. History always found him anyway. So he picked up an old laser rifle, recovered an ancient Athame blade he had hidden years before, gathered the few survivors still willing to follow him, and started walking. Not toward safety, toward destiny. Elsewhere beneath Calth's shattered cities, Captain Remus Ventanus was fighting a very different battle. Thousands of civilians crowded into the underground arcologies. Power systems were failing. Communications had collapsed. Nobody knew how much of the planet had survived. Ventanus established defensive positions throughout the tunnels. Every entrance was fortified. Every corridor covered. If the word-bearers wanted the underground shelters, they would have to earn them. Among those organizing the survivors was Akos Lamiad, one of Ultramar's tetrarchs, a veteran whose body carried the scars of countless campaigns. Together, they turned the ancient underground complexes into a fortress. For a brief moment, it almost seemed enough. Then the prisoners arrived, word-bearers captured during the fighting. One of them was a commander named Morpul Kyr. Unlike most prisoners, Kyr wasn't afraid. He laughed.
He mocked the Ultramarines, mocked Guilliman, mocked the Emperor. He claimed Calth had already fallen, that everything happening above them was only the beginning. Captain Solace finally lost his patience. With a single strike, he cut the word-bearer in half. The execution should have ended the conversation. Instead, it began something far worse. Blood spread across the stone floor. Ancient symbols hidden beneath it began to glow. The temperature dropped, and somewhere in the darkness, something answered.
The answer came in the form of a name that had haunted the galaxy long before the Horus Heresy. Samus. At first, it was only a voice, a whisper echoing through the underground corridors. No one could tell where it came from. It seemed to emerge from the walls, from the darkness, from inside their own helmets. Then the whisper became laughter, and finally, words. I am Samus. The voice spread through every Vox channel simultaneously. I am the man beside you. I am the fear inside you. I am already here. The survivors froze. Even veteran Space Marines looked around in confusion. There was nothing to shoot, nothing to fight. Only the growing certainty that something impossible had entered Calth. Then, Morpul Caxir's corpse began to move, not by its own will. The body twisted violently, bones snapped beneath ruined armor, flesh split apart. Something enormous forced its way into reality through what had once been a human body. Black claws burst through the corpse, massive wings unfolded. A horned silhouette rose above the shattered remains. The demon had crossed into real space. Samus had arrived. Bolters opened fire instantly. Hundreds of rounds tore into the creature. The demon barely reacted. Heavy weapons joined the barrage. Missiles, plasma, melta-fire. Nothing slowed it. Samus tore through the defenders like they weren't there. Space Marines were thrown aside. Imperial Army soldiers vanished beneath monstrous claws. The demon's laughter echoed through the chambers as panic spread among the civilians. Captain Ventanus watched every attack fail. Astartes training taught him that every enemy had a weakness. The problem was finding it before everyone died. Then he noticed something. The demon hadn't appeared on its own. It had crossed into reality through a ritual, through Caxir, through the blood, through the athame. The blade, not the body, not the demon, the ritual itself. Ventanus immediately changed tactics. Instead of trying to destroy Samus, he aimed for the thing anchoring it to reality. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward the creature. The demon turned to meet him. Far too late. Ventanus drove the athame deep into Samus's skull. The effect was immediate. The demon screamed, not in pain, in fury. Its enormous body began breaking apart. Warp energy poured from the wound like black smoke. The monstrous form collapsed inward, then exploded into ash. Within seconds, Samus was gone. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Nobody celebrated. Nobody believed it was truly over.
because everyone present understood the truth. If one demon had crossed into Calth, others could follow. Far above the planet, the battle between the legions continued. Far below the surface, the war had become something else entirely. It was no longer just a civil war. It was a war against the warp itself. And the darkness had only begun to reveal what it had planned for Calth.
While the survivors fought beneath Calth, the battle for the entire system was already being lost. High above the planet, Kor Phaeron had reached the final stage of Lorgar's plan. Calth itself had never been the true objective. Neither had the Ultramarines. Not entirely. The real target was the system's star, Viridia. If the star could be poisoned, every world in the system would die. Using Calth's own planetary defense network, the Word-Bearers seized control of weapons powerful enough to scar entire planets. Originally, those batteries had been built to defend Ultramar. Now they turned toward the sun itself. Without warning, immense energy lances erupted across space. Antimatter warheads followed. One after another, they plunged into Viridia's surface. At first, nothing happened. Then the star changed. Its light became unstable. Solar flares erupted in every direction. Violent storms spread across its surface. Astronomers watched in horror as the stellar core began to collapse into chaos. Kor Phaeron wasn't trying to destroy the sun. He was trying to corrupt it. If Viridia became unstable, Calth would never recover. The entire system would become uninhabitable. Even if Guilliman survived, Ultramar would lose one of its greatest strongholds. A victory without conquest. A punishment far crueler than simple extermination. When Roboute Guilliman finally understood what was happening, he acted immediately. There was no time to save the fleet, no time to regroup, only time to strike. He assembled a small assault force aboard the Macrag's Honor. Among those joining him was Sergeant Aenid Thiel. Only hours earlier, Thiel had been awaiting formal censure. Now, Guilliman personally chose him for one of the most dangerous missions of the war. The impossible had become reality. Everything Thiel had predicted, everything his fellow Ultramarines had mocked, was now happening. Space Marines were fighting Space Marines. Theoretical had become practical. The assault force teleported directly into the captured orbital weapons station. The fighting began the instant they arrived. Every corridor became a battlefield. Brother fought brother at point-blank range. There were no speeches, no hesitation, only survival. Guilliman led from the front. Every swing of his blade cut through traitor Astartes. Every step carried him closer to Kor Phaeron. At the heart of the station, the two finally met. The father who had raised Lorgar, the Primarch who had once called Lorgar brother. Kor Phaeron didn't fear Guilliman. He welcomed him. Warp energy surged around the Dark Cardinal.
black lightning crashed through the chamber. Reality itself seemed to twist beneath his power. Even a Primarch staggered beneath the assault. Kor Phaeron smiled. He didn't need to defeat Guilliman. He only needed to delay him, because every passing second pushed Viridia closer to catastrophe. And outside the station, the dying star continued to burn.
Kor Phaeron had one chance. He intended to use it well. Black lightning surged through the chamber as the Dark Cardinal hurled wave after wave of warp energy toward Guilliman. The Primarch absorbed the first blast. The second forced him back. The third cracked the deck beneath his feet. Kor Phaeron wasn't stronger. He knew that. No mortal warrior could hope to match a Primarch in single combat. But strength wasn't his greatest weapon. Faith was. The same faith that had transformed the Word-bearers. The same faith that had burned Monarchia. The same faith that now fueled chaos itself. "You still don't understand," Kor Phaeron shouted. "The Emperor lied to all of us." Guilliman answered with silence. Then he charged. The distance between them disappeared in an instant. Kor Phaeron unleashed another torrent of warp fire. Guilliman pushed straight through it. His armor blackened. Warning runes flashed across his battle plate. He never slowed. The first blow shattered Kor Phaeron's guard. The second crushed his ribs. The third drove the Dark Cardinal against the chamber wall with enough force to crack reinforced adamantium. For the first time, Kor Phaeron looked afraid. He reached for his athame. The ritual blade shimmered with unnatural light. Warp energy coiled around its edge as he lunged toward Guilliman. Not to kill him, to corrupt him, just as Horus had been corrupted. If Guilliman fell, the Ultramarines would fall with him. The blade came within inches of its target. Then Guilliman caught Kor Phaeron's arm. The Primarch's grip tightened. Bones snapped instantly. Before Kor Phaeron could cry out, Guilliman drove his armored fist straight through his chest. Ceramite shattered. Flesh tore apart. Blood covered the chamber floor. The Dark Cardinal collapsed to his knees, mortally wounded, barely alive. Guilliman looked down at him. For a moment, it seemed the war might end right there. One strike, one death. One less architect of the Horus Heresy. But Kor Phaeron had prepared for failure. Hidden teleport beacons activated throughout the station. Before Guilliman could deliver the final blow, the Dark Cardinal vanished. Only blood remained, and the echo of his laughter. The battle wasn't over. It had simply moved elsewhere. Behind Guilliman, Sergeant Anid Thiel reached the station's primary control systems. Without hesitation, he began destroying them. Control panels exploded beneath his sword. Data cores shattered. Machine spirits fell silent one after another. If the Word-bearers couldn't control the defense network, no one would. It was the only option left. The bombardment finally stopped, but the damage had already been done. Viridia continued to convulse. Its light flickered across the void like a dying heartbeat. The catastrophe could no longer be prevented, only survived.
As Guilliman looked out across the system, he understood the scale of Horus's plan. Calth had never been about winning a battle. It had been about crippling Ultramar, buying time, keeping the largest legion in the Imperium as far away from Terra as possible. And while Guilliman fought for survival, Lorgar was already moving toward his next target. The Shadow Crusade had begun.
While Calth struggled to survive, Lorgar was already looking beyond it. The destruction of the system had never been the final goal. It was only the opening move. With Guilliman trapped inside Ultramar, the word-bearers launched what history would remember as the Shadow Crusade. Their new allies were unlike any legion they had fought beside before. The World Eaters, a legion that no longer cared for strategy, no longer cared for conquest, only slaughter. At their head marched Angron, the Red Angel. Every battle pushed him closer to madness. The butcher's nails buried inside his brain never stopped. Every heartbeat brought pain. Every moment without violence became unbearable. The nails had turned battle into the only relief he could still feel. Lorgar understood that better than anyone. He knew his brother was dying. Not from wounds, from the nails themselves. And if nothing changed, Angron would eventually destroy himself. But saving Angron was only part of Lorgar's plan. He believed the gods had chosen his brother for something greater, something eternal. The Shadow Crusade began with world after world falling before the traitor advance. Cities burned, entire populations vanished. Every victory fed the warp. Every death strengthened the powers Lorgar now worshipped. The objective was never simple conquest. It was sacrifice. Every battlefield became part of a ritual. Every massacre another offering. As the campaign spread across Ultramar, one world stood above all others. Armatura. More than a fortress, more than a military academy. Armatura trained generations of Ultramar's officers. Its shipyards armed entire sectors. Its academies produced some of the finest commanders in the Imperium. Destroying Armatura would cripple Guilliman's future almost as much as Calth had crippled his present. As the invasion fleet approached, another conversation unfolded far from the battlefield, across the warp itself. Magnus the Red reached out to Lorgar. The Primarch of the Thousand Suns had seen enough of chaos to recognize where this path ended. He warned his brother. The gods offered knowledge, but they always demanded something in return. Lorgar listened, then calmly rejected the warning. He no longer believed chaos was corrupting humanity. He believed chaos was revealing the truth the Emperor had hidden. The conversation ended without either Primarch changing the other's mind. Meanwhile, aboard the flagship Conqueror, two warriors prepared for another campaign. Khârn, captain of the World Eaters, and Argel Tal, commander of the Gal Vorbak. Few friendships during the heresy were as genuine as theirs. They came from different legions, followed different Primarchs, walked different paths, yet both understood what it meant to watch their brothers disappear beneath the weight of destiny. Khârn fought against the butcher's nails every waking moment.
Argel Tal shared his body with the demon Rom. Each carried a curse the other could understand. Neither realized how little time they had left together. Ahead of them waited Armatura, and beyond that, the final chapter of their friendship.
Armatura was ready for war. Its orbital defenses stretched across the void. Weapons platforms guarded every approach. Shipyards operated around the clock. Millions of soldiers stood ready behind enormous fortress walls. To any Imperial commander, Armatura looked impossible to conquer. The word-bearers had no intention of conquering it. They intended to break it. The invasion began with orbital bombardments. Moments later, assault craft punched through the atmosphere. World Eaters hit the surface first. They didn't advance in formation. They charged. Every defensive line became a massacre. Every street became an execution ground. The Ultramarines fought with discipline. The World Eaters fought with rage. Neither side gave ground willingly. As the battle spread across the city, the defenders triggered a desperate contingency. Entire districts were demolished. Massive buildings collapsed onto advancing traitor forces. Roads disappeared beneath mountains of concrete and steel. The goal wasn't victory. It was delay. For a brief moment, it worked. At the center of the collapse, thousands of tons of debris buried Angron beneath the ruins. The Red Angel vanished beneath shattered towers and broken stone. Across the battlefield, panic spread through the World Eaters. Their Primarch was gone. Many believed he was dead. Khârn refused to accept it. So did the few librarians still serving the Legion. The Butcher's nails had nearly wiped them out years earlier. Only a handful remained alive. Together they formed a psychic communion. Combining what little strength they had left, they searched for Angron's mind beneath the ruins. At first, nothing. Then they felt it. Rage. Endless. Unrelenting. Alive. Their psychic guidance gave Angron a direction, a path. The Red Angel answered with a roar that echoed through the shattered city. The ground shook violently. Cracks spread through the collapsed streets. Then the mountain of rubble exploded outward. Angron emerged from beneath the ruins like a force of nature. Bleeding, broken, furious. The sight reignited the entire assault. World Eaters charged with renewed violence. The Ultramarines found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to die. Elsewhere on the battlefield, Lorgar watched in silence. This wasn't merely another victory. Every death, every burning city, every battlefield brought Angron one step closer to the destiny Lorgar believed the gods had prepared for him. The Shadow Crusade was no longer just a military campaign. It had become a ritual. And Armatura was only another sacrifice. Far above the planet, more traitor warships emerged from the warp. The campaign was growing larger with every passing day. And after Armatura, only one destination remained: Nuceria.
the world where Angron's story had begun, and where Lorgar intended to change his brother's fate forever.
Nuceria was unlike any world the World Eaters had conquered. To the Imperium, it was another compliant planet. To Angron, it was the place where his life had ended. Long before he became a Primarch, long before he led a legion, he had been a slave, forced to fight in the arenas, forced to watch friends die beside him, forced to survive while better people fell around him. Even after all these years, the butcher's nails could never erase those memories. Lorgar knew that, which was exactly why he brought the Shadow Crusade here. Not simply to destroy another world, to reopen an old wound. As the invasion fleet entered orbit, Angron barely spoke. He didn't need to. Every mountain, every ruined fortress, every valley reminded him of the brothers and sisters he had failed to save. While preparations for the invasion continued, another drama unfolded aboard the Word-Bearer's fleet. Cyrene Valentian had returned, once the survivor of Monarchia, now known throughout the Legion as the Blessed Lady. To many, she had become a symbol of Lorgar's faith. To others, something even stranger, because death itself had failed to claim her. Not everyone welcomed her return. Among those moving through the shadows was Daemon Prytanis, a perpetual, an agent of the mysterious Cabal. He believed Cyrene still had a role to play in the future of the galaxy, one that did not include the Word-Bearers. He attempted to take her by force. The confrontation was brief, violent, and unsuccessful. Before Prytanis could escape, the Legion's warriors intercepted him. Green alchemical fire engulfed his body. Within seconds, nothing remained but ash. Yet even death meant little to a perpetual. He would return, someday. Soon afterward, Angron descended to the surface, not to wage war, not yet. He walked toward a place called Deshalika Ridge, Argel Tal, Khârn, and Lorgar followed in silence. No one spoke. They all understood this place mattered. Scattered across the barren hills lay thousands of weathered human bones. No monuments, no graves. Only the remains of forgotten gladiators. The men and women Angron had once called family. This was where they had made their final stand against the High Riders of Nuceria. This was where they had expected to die together. Instead, the Emperor had taken Angron away. His friends had been left behind to face death alone. Angron slowly knelt among the bones. His enormous hands drifted across the weathered remains. For a long time, no one moved. Then, quietly, the Primarch spoke. "I died here. Not on some distant battlefield, not during the Horus Heresy. Here. The Emperor saved my life, but he murdered everything that made it worth living." No one answered. There was nothing anyone could say. Lorgar watched his brother carefully. This grief, this rage, this unbearable sense of betrayal. It was exactly what the gods required. And before Nuceria fell, Lorgar intended to transform that suffering into something far more terrible than vengeance. The invasion of Nuceria became more than another battle. It became a reckoning. As cities burned across the planet, the Ultramarines finally arrived. Roboute Guilliman had come for one reason: to end the Shadow Crusade. His fleet slammed into the traitor blockade while thousands of warriors descended onto the surface below. For the first time since Calth, the two Primarchs faced one another again. Guilliman wasted no words, no speeches, no negotiations. He attacked. Lorgar met him head-on. The battle was brutal. Guilliman fought like the commander who had built an empire. Every strike was calculated, every movement precise. Lorgar had changed since Monarchia. The warp had made him stronger, but he was still no match for Guilliman in single combat. The Lord of Ultramar drove him backward again and again. Each blow shattered armor. Each strike forced Lorgar closer to defeat. For a brief moment, it looked as though the first heretic would finally fall. Then Angron arrived. The Red Angel crashed into the battlefield with unstoppable fury. Guilliman immediately turned to face him. The duel that followed shook the world itself. Power fists clashed against chain axes. Mountains echoed with every impact. Neither Primarch gave an inch. Around them, thousands of legionaries continued killing one another while Lorgar stepped back. Not to recover, to begin the ritual. Everything since Calth had led to this moment. The massacres, the sacrifices, the Shadow Crusade. Every death had been another offering to the dark gods. Now Lorgar called upon them one final time. The warp answered. Reality twisted. The skies above Nuceria darkened. Blood rained from the heavens. The butcher's nails that had tormented Angron for decades suddenly became something more. The pain reached its peak, then disappeared. Angron screamed, not in agony, in transformation. His body began to grow. Armor split apart beneath expanding muscle. Great wings burst from his back. His flesh turned crimson. Horns erupted from his skull. The Primarch of the World Eaters died that day. In his place rose something immortal, something terrible. A demon Primarch. The first loyal sons watching the transformation could hardly believe what they were seeing. Even Guilliman hesitated, only for a heartbeat. But it was enough. The ritual was complete. The gods had claimed Angron forever. The cost was immeasurable. The last fragments of the warrior who had once fought beside his fellow slaves on Nuceria were gone. Lorgar had saved his brother's life, but he had destroyed his soul. As the battlefield descended into chaos, another tragedy unfolded nearby. Argel Tal fought beside Khârn as he had countless times before. Brothers by choice rather than blood. One keeping the other from falling completely into darkness. Watching from the shadows was Erebus. He had seen enough. Argel Tal's loyalty to Khârn made him dangerous. As long as that friendship existed, Khârn might never become the perfect servant of chaos. So Erebus acted. Without warning, he drove an athame into Argel Tal's back. The wound was fatal. Ram screamed inside its host. Khârn reached his friend too late. Argel Tal collapsed into his arms. The greatest warrior of the Gal Vorbak, dead not by an Ultramarine, not by Guilliman, but by one of his own brothers. Erebus disappeared before anyone could stop him, leaving behind only silence and a grief that would soon become rage. The Shadow Crusade was over. Calth had burned. Armatura had fallen. Nuceria had died. Angron had become a demon Primarch, and Khârn had lost the only friend who ever understood him. But one final reckoning still remained, because Erebus had made one mistake. He had left Khârn alive, and Khârn never forgot a debt.